So back in the late 70s, before you volunteered to go overseas, what were you doing? What was your life at that point?
Well, at that point, I had finished graduating from school in '77. I joined in '76. I worked with the Commonwealth Games. I did full-time employment for 9 months, and that was quite the experience. And while I was doing the Commonwealth Games is when I volunteered to go overseas. Employment wasn't that easy at that point around here, especially for a female in the reserves. And so I was just taking military employment as I could, call-outs, courses. So I took my courses very quickly. Can we scratch that and I can start again?
Just go ahead. Yeah. So what were you doing back then? Just in terms of just where were you at in your life? Yeah.
I was a young kid. I was 18, 19 years old. I was only 19 when I went over. So there wasn't much that I had done yet because I just got out of high school and was trying to feel where I belonged and what I really wanted to do. And the forces was a good place to hang out at that time.
So what was your motivation for volunteering to go overseas? Why did you want to go overseas?
Well, I'm a bit of a history buff, and my grandfather and my great-grandfather both fought in the First World War for different countries. And I very much believed in the peacekeeping stuff. And when I was in junior high school, I believe is when the Canadians died. There was a whole bunch of them that died in a helicopter crash. And I remember people saying that the Canadians shouldn't be over there, that we didn't belong in the Middle East. But I was very proud of the peacekeeping attitude. And I was very young when I saw the Vietnam veterans come home and how bad a shape they were in. I had this really bad feeling about war, and I just thought that peacekeeping was a really good thing to do. And so as soon as I was old enough, I volunteered.
So you said earlier it was a bit difficult as a female back then in the military to get an overseas deployment. Why was that?
Well, I think if you went as a clerk or a fin clerk or communications, you were okay. But in my trade as a vehicle tech, most of the jobs were considered a field unit. And at the time, females were not allowed to be attached to a field unit. It was okay in the reserves, but not in the regular forces or on the bases. I wasn't allowed in Germany. I wasn't allowed in Cyprus, the Golan Heights. The only base I could go to was Egypt. And why? We don't know. We think there might have been an error made.
So you applied to go to Egypt. Did your application go through smoothly, or were there any hurdles?
Well, actually, it went through smoothly, except my orderly room wouldn't do the paperwork because my orderly sergeant thought it would be a waste of time since no female would go in my trade. And so I had to do all the paperwork myself. And it took a long time when you're typing with 2 fingers because I did the search and find method. So I had to do my paperwork for the application, security clearance, arrange for all the medical stuff. And when it first came back that it was accepted, my sergeant thought there was an error made, so he sent a message off say, "You do know that this is a female." Because back then we had to do brackets W after our name or before. But it was definitely identified, so they knew right off the bat you're a female.
Just in general, how common was it in your unit at that time for anyone to deploy?
Well, the Sally Horse got to go to places, like the armored guys did, and the infantry did some stuff, but nobody from my unit, nobody from Service Battalion had been on a UN tour. And at the time, I didn't know that because I'd only been in the unit for a couple of years when I applied. But supposedly I was the first one from my unit to go, and supposedly I was the first female reserve mechanic in the history of the forces to go over in peacetime. I didn't know I wasn't supposed to apply.
At that time, what did you do? Do you remember what you did for your workup training, for your preparation?
Well, I had to pass the medical here, which was nothing, right? But then you had to pass we had to run 1.5 miles. In those days, we just had to run 1.5 miles, and they gave a time limit, and that was it. And then I did 6 weeks training in Saint Hubert, Quebec, before I went over. They just wanted to make sure we knew our job, and they taught us a little bit about the customs of what went on there and the history between the 2 countries. So we had a little knowledge of what we were doing.
So what did you think you were getting into? What did you think it was going to be like over there?
I had no idea, but I just didn't know that the country was so poor. Like it was just, I was so grateful to be a Canadian. When I got off that plane and I saw how the people were. But the other thing that ran through my mind is that they had fighting there from the First World War, the Second World War, you know, the fights against Israel. And here was a generation of people that just wanted peace. And if we could keep them apart long enough, they might be able to work it out. So, but I just didn't expect what I saw. First thing that ran through my mind when I was on the bus going through Cairo, and some guy was laughing at me and he said, "So little girl, you glad you volunteered?" And all I could think of was, where'd all my UNICEF money go? Couldn't believe people could live like that. But I was young and very naive.
What did you hope for yourself from this tour? Like, is there a particular experience you hope for, or do you remember?
No, I think I just went with the naive attitude that I was hoping to make a difference somewhere and just do a job, just get the experience, see the pyramids, just do a job. I wasn't trying to make anything other than just doing a job.
So, tell me a bit more about, you hit the ground, like when did you arrive, and what are your other impressions of the place and the people when you first get there?
Most of the people the people that dealt with us on base were pretty good. We had been given rules and regulations before we went. All the females, we weren't allowed to travel without a male, usually, unless there was 3 of us. We weren't allowed to wear our shorts off base unless our shorts went down to our knees. Our shoulders had to be covered at all times. We had a very strict clothing thing, and they told us that if we misbehaved or we didn't dress appropriately or we got caught doing something, we would be sent home. It was a little bit of a different army than it is now. They did get sent home from Afghanistan. That's not what I meant. I was so caught up at the time because I was so young. They gave me a bunch of rules and regulations and I just followed them. And I just wanted to do something different. All my friends were in school or getting married or doing something, and I just wanted to do something that was totally different than them.
So, yeah, that reminds me of a question I should have asked you, but I forgot to. What did your family and friends say when you told them you were going to Egypt with the military?
Well, my mom wasn't very happy. She was very concerned. She was older. She knew the history. I didn't know that much of the history. I didn't realize that they had been fighting not that long before, that peace really wasn't that old there. My dad, he couldn't figure out why I couldn't act more like a girl. So, my grandfather, because he was in the area with the army in the First World War, he just told me to watch out for the camels, that they spit, and told me to have a good time. My friends were pretty good about things. The commanding officer of service battalion at the time, he gave me a father-daughter talk before I went, which was pretty cool.
What did he say?
He told me to make sure that I just treated the guys like I would a brother, and not to hang around with one too many, particularly too long or dry. Yeah.
So let's just do it again. So yeah, what advice did your CO give you?
He told me to keep my nose clean and try not to hang around with one guy too much or anything, and just treat all the guys like my brother. I was the only female that was working in the garage where I was on second line maintenance, and so there was all the guys and me. At first line maintenance had 1 female, and I was the 1 female in second, and apparently there hadn't been a female there in second line maintenance before. So he just wanted to make sure that I just kept my nose clean and didn't do anything to hurt myself or the reputation, if that makes any sense.
Did you have any concerns going into it about those gender relations?
A little bit, because I'd already run against it in Borden when I was in training. The Reg Force were our instructors, and they were pretty narrow-minded about what a female could or couldn't do. In fact, there was one of the guys that I was working with on my course. He didn't trust anything I did while we were on course, and so I kind of zapped him. I put the battery cables back on while he was underneath to play with the starter. And so when he stuck the screwdriver up there, he got a little bit of a shock. So I kind of learned to hold my own. I didn't do anything to really cause a problem, but it was like if they were going to pick on me, I picked back. And I didn't go whining to anybody. I just kind of held my ground, and I did my job, and eventually things would level off. If you chirp a lot, you make attention, and then people start to treat you differently. And I just wanted to be one of them, and just wanted to do what I could.
What was it like? What were the accommodations, the area like in Ismailia where you were, I guess, for your tour?
It was hot. It was really hot. I was fortunate. I was one of the few people that got to go into an air-conditioned trailer. Other than that, there was what we called the Brabat Hotel, is where the females stayed. Pretty original name, right? Brabat. Everything that involved women was called Brabat back there, Bra Battalion. And so, yeah. But the funniest story about what happened to me when I got there was, being a female in the reserves, we weren't given combats. We had to choose between a work dress uniform or a combat uniform. And so we didn't get full issue of combat at that. We got the shirt and the pants. And when I went to Egypt, I didn't have any green t-shirts. I was issued white t-shirts for gym, but no green t-shirts because women weren't in field units, therefore they didn't have combats, therefore they didn't have green t-shirts. And the chief warrant officer actually had to go down with me to base clothing so that I could get some green t-shirts, because I was sent there twice and they just said, no, you can't have them. And I was getting my white t-shirts all dirty and greasy and everything else. And the chief kind of laughed at the supply tech and said, well, she's here, we have to dress her. And that's how I ended up with my green t-shirts. So it's little things happened here or there, but most of the guys treated me like a little sister. I was only 19 years old, and I probably looked like I was 15 or 16. So I was lucky. I was fortunate.
So you had the air-conditioned trailer. What else was there on this camp? Like, how was it set up?
Well, we had a swimming pool, and as long as the power was on, we could go in the swimming pool. So that wasn't bad, but quite often the Egyptian power failed us, and so we weren't allowed in the pool. We had our junior ranks clubs, we had the bars, the messes, and we had movies every night outdoor. We'd grab a chair from the mess hall and sit outside on a cement pad and watch a movie every night. So it kind of got hard. When I got back to Canada, I didn't get a movie. But it got dark shortly after supper, and then I would have to talk by ham radio when I got a call once a week. And so this guy in BC would take the radio call and then make a long distance phone call to my mom. And that was once a week. And because I was from Western Canada, I got up at 4:30 in the morning to make the call. And the other guys that were from Eastern Canada, they made it before they went to bed. So the good thing about that was I knew the score of the football games before anybody else did.
You mentioned the messes. What was the mess life like? What was the policy on alcohol back then? Was there a policy?
The only policy was that if you got drunk and you couldn't function the next day, that you got charged. If you hurt yourself or you hurt somebody else, you were charged. There was no real limit on alcohol because it was so hot that if you drank too much, you were so sick. And that happened only once to me, and I thought I was going to die. Everything hurt. You were so dehydrated because of the heat that it was unbearable. So most people learned after the first time not to do it again. It was brutal. But like I said, as long as you kept your nose clean, they didn't say much. But if you couldn't work because you were hungover, that was a different story. Yeah. And stuff was changing by then. It was starting to change.
Starting to change. It took a while.
But it was just the little things. It was like, what do you mean I can't have that shirt?
What about, just what was your average day like from start to finish?
The average day is you got up. Our work day actually started at 7 in the morning because by 3 o'clock in the afternoon it was too hot to work. So we would be at the mess halls at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, eat your food, and then you'd go to work, and lunch would be around 11. And then you go back and you'd work until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then you would hopefully hit the pool to cool down, especially as a vehicle tech because it was so hot. Like the buildings were hot, and then people would bring in a vehicle and the engine would be hot, and you'd lean over top and your sweat would just sizzle off the exhaust manifold, and yeah, it was pretty warm. And we had to wear coveralls on top, so it usually got toasty. And lots of flies. Lots of flies. It was a bit of a contest at one point. You learned not to go to the mess hall and have two glasses of something and your food, because you had to have one hand to wave over top of your plate and you kept the other hand over top of your glass. So again, you learned after the first time when you sat down and realized you made a mistake not to grab 2 glasses of fluids.
Aside from the alcohol, did you ever get seriously ill there from anything?
Well, actually what happened to me is I participated in sports, and I got run over at home plate by a little French infantry guy. I managed to hold on to the ball, but chipped my front tooth, knocked me out, put my leg in a cast. So yeah, that was my claim to fame, was to go all the way over there to actually put a cast on one of my limbs.
And what about time off, time away from the camp? You mentioned you had to go out in threes if you were a female. Did you get much time off, and where did you go if you did?
Well, you could go off whenever you want, as long as your shift was over for the day, and you got your leave pass, and you just went out the gates of the base, and you went to town. In the town, there was a couple of nice restaurants, and it was sometimes nice just to go off. I stayed on base quite a bit and just played sports, volleyball, baseball. I even got involved with the AV teams, the AV audiovisual guys, so I would play tapes so that people could watch TV shows from back home. There was bands, there was all sorts of stuff to do in your off time. And then because I had vehicles, because I was a maintenance person and we were attached there, so part of service time, I could pull a vehicle if I wanted to. I applied for it, and if there was a vehicle available, you could take the vehicle and go to Port Said or go into Cairo and go see the pyramids. And it was a big white truck with UN written on the door, so everybody ran behind you trying to get money from you, but you got the wheels to go. So it was a good experience. I would never have missed it.
But it got cut short. Can you explain that?
Well, what happened in 1978, Egypt and Israel actually met at Camp David and had a peace agreement. And so the mandate, the UN, to keep the full force there was coming up. And the United Nations decided not to keep the full force there anymore, and they were changing to an observation force. And because I was a female, I wasn't allowed in any other base overseas. So between the fact that my leg was in a cast and they thought I'd heal better in Canada, and that I couldn't be employed in any other base overseas, I got sent home, whereas most of the other people got sent to Cyprus or the Golan Heights to finish off their contract. But not knowing my rights, I got sent home and unemployed.
So at the time, didn't occur to you that anything wrong with that, or you could fight that, or?
No, and even nobody back home told me either. They didn't say, because of medical reasons, that's the excuse that they used, was my leg. They should have employed me back in Canada, but they didn't. And then, of course, because my leg was sore, I couldn't get a job in the civilian world until I healed up. But I was too young to know what to do, and there was nobody there that told me what to do. So I always just thought if the military did it, that was just the way the military did it, and didn't question too much. They had their own rules, right? We didn't have the Charter of Rights back then. That came in the 80s, so basically what the military wanted to do, they did.
So with the issues that you described earlier, like related to gender and like employability and stuff, did you just generally, at the time, just accept that that's just the way it was?
Yep, because they just said, oh, you're female, you can't do this, you can't do that. Originally when I went to join the reserves, because I didn't want to wear a skirt and learn how to type, that wasn't my thing. I had taken automotives in school, but my first choice was actually to be an engineer. I wanted to build a bridge and then learn how to blow it up. And when I went to the 8th Field Engineers, they looked at me and they said, oh, you be a clerk. And I said, no, they told me I could build a bridge and blow it up. They said, no, females can't do that. That's a field unit thing. You'll be a clerk. And so I went back to recruiting, and then I went over to maintenance company from there. And that's how I ended up as a vehicle tech.
And how rare was it, even in Canada, to have a female vehicle tech?
There wasn't a whole lot of us. On my first course, there was another female from Thunder Bay. Nope, sorry, that was my second course. My first course, I was the only female on course. And then on my second course, there was one from Thunder Bay. She'd been in a year or two longer than I had. The Reg Force had a handful of female mechanics, but there is very, very few mechanics that were female that were in the reserves. It's just one of those things that there was lots in transport, lots in supply, but not as a mechanic. Even the MPs had females. But I was the only female at the time with our unit here as well.
For me as a guy, wasn't that lonely?
Not really. I had two brothers, and so I was used to having no other females around. Like when my mom was there, but I mean, I had to learn to cooperate with my brothers or I'd have a very lonely childhood. So that's probably where I learned to stick up for myself and do things like put the battery terminals back, the post back on, connect the battery. So just things, but it didn't bother me. I always just looked and thought we just had things to do, and you know, if they wanted to be a-holes about it, I just didn't have anything to do with them.
You sort of told me, I'm just curious to know just a bit more about coming home. So you're 3 months, you have this life-changing experience, but now you've got to get used to being a civilian again. Was that much of an adjustment when you came home? And you came home early.
Yeah, it was a bit of adjustment because the food changed immediately. I got sick when I got home. I didn't get sick when I was there. I got sick when I got back to the good food. Of course, the time thing changed. I didn't need to get up so early in the morning, and not only that, it was flipped around too. And then people would take me in for an interview for a job. They'd be excited when I showed them on my resume what was going on with my life. And they'd bring me in because, hey, this is a female that's in the forces and she's been overseas. And so they asked me all sorts of questions, and then they wouldn't give me the job because they were afraid I needed time off to do military stuff. So yeah, I found it very, very difficult. It was about 6 months before I could find a job after I came home. They just thought I would take off again. So.
And how were you treated in your unit when you came back with this experience under your belt?
Everybody was pretty cool about it. They when we went on parades and we went to different places, they would stick me in front. Mind you, because of my height, I usually ended up in the front row in the center. But they would make sure that everybody could always see the one soldier that had the UN medal on. And when they finally accepted the Blue Berets on Remembrance Day, they shipped me to the Butter Dome so that they could see. They had all the Blue Berets out in the same place because there were so few of us that they wanted to make sure they were seen. So no, the unit was very good about it.
So what was that like, being kind of the poster girl for deployments?
Again, I was so young, it didn't even dawn on me. I just thought it was pretty cool that people were proud of me, that I did what I did, but I didn't really consider myself the poster girl. It was just, and then because I was cross-trained after a while with transport, I ended up driving some of the other people around because I had the medal. So they would ask if I wanted to drive the staff car, and so I did that.
So when you look back at the whole experience, it was only 3 months, but pretty big for at your age, I would think. How do you think that affected you as a person and then as a soldier?
Well, first of all, as a person, it really, I was always proud to be a Canadian. But boy, when I saw how they treated women there, it wasn't just a matter of reading it in the books or seeing a film clip, but to see how women were really treated in other countries and how children were treated. Sorry. It just made me really glad that even though things were rough here, it was a whole lot better life than just by chance I was born here and not born over there. And so it taught me to appreciate the ground that I came from and the opportunities, even though there was still opening for women, because I was young enough that I didn't realize that women didn't have a strong history in the military. There was a women's history, more of it during wartime than peacetime. But not knowing that society in general, the women's rights really didn't start until 10 years before. And that everything that the females were doing in the forces, a lot of it was groundbreaking, and it was making an opening for our future. But to know that we were doing that in Canada, and yet in the Middle East and in some countries, the puppy dogs were treated better than women and children. And the sickness and the disease. And we had this thing called the Sweetwater Canal that ran in behind the base. And there would be dead bodies in it every once in a while. And you'd see kids getting bathed in one end of it and people going to the bathroom in the other end. And I appreciated that I had a home, that I had health care, and that generally speaking, I should be okay. That I wouldn't have to worry about just everyday life conditions. Sorry.
Is there a day or an incident from your tour that stands out for you as being particularly memorable? It could be a good one, a good memory, a bad memory, happy, sad.
Well, let me tell you, when I got run over at home plate, that was quite memorial. But being a vehicle tech, they brought in a Jeep. It wasn't a Jeep, it was like a 1.25 ton truck, 3/4 ton truck. And I was still new to the base, and that's when a Canadian died. And what happened is the Egyptians had a habit of, if their vehicle broke down on the highway, they would just pile rocks behind it. They wouldn't put any lights out, but they would just pile rocks behind it. Sometimes they would just leave equipment in the middle of the road. So one weekend, Canadians, there was 3 of them in a vehicle, and one died. They ran into the back end. I can't remember if they're the ones that hit the flatbed or they ran into the rock pile. And they brought the vehicle in to maintenance because we had to write it off. That was part of the job. And it was like a great big V. Like the wheels were almost off the ground, like the frame. So it was a little surprising to see that. And then it was a week or 2 later, Polish guys got into an accident, same type of thing on the highway, and they died. So it was just, even though everything was safe and we knew that they wanted peace there, we listened to the artillery fire at night there because UN passed up the vote, right? And so all this anti-aircraft stuff showed up overnight. So it wasn't just one particular thing, it was just a few little things that happened together that it just like reminded me of things. But no, probably if I had to do anything that stayed with me for life was seeing that vehicle after the accident. And when I switched to transport and I was I did a lot of safety and training, and I never forgot, we lose more people through vehicle accidents than we do being shot. Well, now I guess Afghanistan changed that, but quite a few of the soldiers died because of vehicle accidents.
What about, just my last question, but what about other security concerns? Because you said, right, the fighting had just ended 5 or 6 years earlier, the Yom Kippur War. Were there incidents between the Egyptians and the Israelis, or you're caught in the middle? Or?
No, in actual fact, I think both sides wanted peace so badly that when they finally signed the Camp David peace agreement, that there was this buffer zone, and the UN was between them. And at that time, people respected the UN soldiers. Like, they didn't shoot at us too often. Things happened by accident, but they didn't go out of their way to attack a UN force. And heck, I don't think we even had enough ammo and weapons on the base to defend ourselves if they tried to, as it was. But an old guy, when I was talking to one of the old guys, it was an Egyptian that was working with us, and I asked him about it, and I said, I know some of the younger guys aren't happy with the peace agreement, and some people, have complained about this. I said, how do you feel? And he just said, we've been fighting here for 70 years, 80 years. He said, it's got to stop. And so with that attitude, there was a lot of people that just wanted peace. And because Israel was starting to give Egypt back the Sinai Peninsula, there was more information coming about how the Israeli soldiers were having to forcibly move their own people by gunpoint out of homes and things that they had made in the Sinai Peninsula. There was more information about that than there was any problems between Egypt and Israel that I know of. So there was just a strong desire to just stop fighting.
Did you ever want or try to deploy again?
Yes, I did. When Bosnia started, because there was a pretty big gap between Egypt, because in Cyprus, in the Golan Heights, there wasn't much work for service battalion people, and again, the jobs for females didn't really open up until the late 80s, early 90s, because in some of the bases across Canada, I wasn't even allowed in until later in the 80s. So when Bosnia opened up, I really wanted to do that, but I had actually fallen out of one too many trucks by that point and messed my back up a little bit, and I couldn't pass a physical to go overseas if my life depended on it, which it would have depended on it. So no, it kind of broke my heart that the only one overseas posting I got was when I was only 19 years old, and I never got to go back anywhere again after that. So.
Is there anything I haven't asked you about that you want to say to sort of wrap things up? It
was a really awesome experience. There was times, I got homesick. The forces in general, I'm really, really glad I did it. Didn't know at the time that I would be doing things that other females would later look upon as breaking ground for them, because I didn't know that the ground hadn't already been broken. Particularly with women going to different bases or their employments. And I think I keep saying I'm sorry. The redress that I put in at the end of my career, it wasn't because I wanted to screw the military around, or I wanted to change something, because something was wrong. When a female is ready and able to work, especially in the reserves, because you have other jobs, you're going to work or you're working someplace else, so when you move, you should be able to just transfer to another unit. It shouldn't matter if you're a male or a female. And so while I was going to college, I applied to go to Lethbridge to transfer there, because that's where I was going to school, and it was refused because there were no female positions available. Yet they were taking young guys off the street as recruits, and I was trained as a mechanic and as a transport person, and I had no job while I was going to school the first year. So when I got out of the forces, an older retired Air Force officer said to me, you know what? He said, just end your employment earlier, put in a redress about the time that's missing for your employment, because you were able to work, they couldn't employ you. And I thought it was far-fetched, because the rules were followed. And I understood that at the time. But I did. I followed his instructions, and I made up a redress, and it made it all the way through. And I even got a letter from the Chief of Defense Staff thanking me for my service to the country, and saying that they were going to change the rules, and that information was sent on to NDHQ, and rules were changed. And I wasn't the only one that benefited from that redress. I understand that some female officers got promotions and got back pay because they were denied promotions because they never had the field aspect, and it was because they were never allowed to. So just little things like that. So I'm glad that I left with a positive note.
And when was that?
I put in my redress at Christmas in '98. I believe it started right around the time I got out, and I know that it took probably about a year and a half to work its way through the system, or to 2 years. It was quite a while.
So if a young woman asked you today for advice about whether or not she should join the forces, what would you tell her?
I would say, if you can handle some teasing and a little bit of stuff, go for it, because everybody, male, female, short, tall, chubby, skinny, somebody's going to find something to pick on you for. So if you can have a little bit of a thick skin, that it's a great place to be, make some friends that are going to last you for your life. And learn to take a joke, learn to give a joke, and make a career of it, because it is a really good place to be. You do something that other people pay money to go in a Jeep, and they go 4x4ing. They pay us to drive around in the dark with no lights on. Pretty cool.
That's great. Thanks very much.
Okay.